Hello everyone and welcome back to the campaign diary for my Rime of the Frostmaiden campaign Aracséa edition. In today's session, the party explore the next level of the dungeon, fight a shape-shifting spirit and can potentially uncover the secret behind the origin of an entire peoples. So a lot to talk about in today's session, especially when it comes to the lore of the world and a lot of things the players now have full-on hints about for certain aspects of the world and even big things that aren't known to the Araxian community as a whole. Now, first of all, this is not a typical dungeon crawl, as I usually like to follow the 5-room dungeon format. As you may have seen from the other sessions, I'm not big on doing tons of little fights in between getting to the boss rooms, and since this dungeon thus far, I think they've had about, encounter-wise, they've had about 3 somewhat difficult encounters without a long rest. So at this point, they're getting somewhat low on resources, somewhat low on health. Granted, they have had a short rest, so they're a little bit up to scratch. So with that in mind, there isn't a whole lot for them to fight in this dungeon until the very end with a lengthy boss fight against the Spirit of Ravicin. At least what they believe to be the Spirit of Ravicin or something like that. Also, as far as prep goes for things like this, I don't do a whole lot. As you can see, I usually make or grab a dungeon layout from somewhere or repurpose all of it, if not most of it, of the map. Write a couple notes, keep stat blocks at hand, make a note of any puzzles or riddles or any like scripted speeches or whatever. But beyond that, I do most of the descriptions and things sort of ad lib. And that in general is my DM's style, with very few notes made, just simply instead relying on my familiarity with my own homebrew world and more importantly the scenario at hand. Being able to adapt and try and focus in on what I want to happen in that moment and what story beats I need to have arise. If there's something like like I said, like a speech or something like that that I should probably prepare ahead of time, I normally do. But most other stuff, it's literally just stat blocks, bare minimum notes, and maybe a layout, and everything else is pretty much straight from my head, unless it's with what I have envisioned for that scene. So yes, I've been thinking about perhaps doing a shift of focus in these episodes. Instead of being like a play-by-play of events, maybe just doing the interesting bits and like the lore discoveries, but we shall see how things go. Not too sure if I want to make that shift just yet. It would make things a lot easier for me, but let's see how we go. It's this whole notion, I guess, kind of came out of a thought I had the other day where I feel like in more recent episodes, it's literally all been like a play-by-play. There's not really been much, little to no thoughts from my end either, because it's pretty simple stuff what's going on, and I guess it's just something to think about for myself. That said, today's session and the upcoming sessions, we have a lot of wiggle room to talk about side things. We have a lot of lore to discuss. And a lot of thoughts from my side of the DM screen, as it were. So things to note about the place that they're in, about this third layer of this dungeon, whatever it is. This is a long abandoned, it seems, temple to Isha, the Ainari goddess of light and life, one of the 2 figureheads of the Ainari religion, a goddess who in fact is still worshipped today by the elves in the Vindel wildlands to the south of the Frostgales. And while, yes, it is an old and reverent place, it has indeed been corrupted by Orcus of all deities, the Prince of Paradise as he is known in Aracséa, the great demon lord of undeath, who has actually been dead for quite some time canonically. The specifics being he was cast into the Four Winds and separated during the last immersion of the War of the Flames, which is kind of my reoccurring version of the War of Blood from most D&D mythoses. It's the eternal war between devils and demons. And so yes, he was cast away in many separate pieces along with his wand, his tool of office, and has been quartered for most of the last couple thousand years. But however, following the events of Campaign 1, or rather like in coincidence with the events in my other campaign, my solo campaign, someone or a group of someone is seemingly trying to bring him back. And they're doing this by feeding Orcus magic, essentially, raw magic from the world, located in nexus sites and ley lines throughout Aracséa that kind of breathe life through the planet like a blood, like veins and arteries. The primary way thus far in the other campaign that this has been seen to be done is through corruption that is found around what are known as Inari travel rooms. A name pending. I still need to come up with a better name than Inari travel rooms, but that's what we're going with for now. Basically, they're sort of rooms hidden throughout Inari lands and old ruins that can be used like a Stargate, if you've ever seen that, to kind of take you from one room to somewhere else in the world, or indeed to a place the Inari fashioned called the Nexus, which is a place in the Astral Sea where you can go there, and then from there you can go anywhere else. Assuming you have the correct crystals and things like that to try and get to the place you want to. Inari, for those who didn't know, actually sort of discovered the Astral Sea when they first arrived on Aracséa, and they were able to manipulate it to do things like these travel rooms, and was the primary reason for why they had such a domineering and successful empire. Before they fell, as all great ancient civilizations do. For why they fell is a mystery within the annals of the world. A mystery, however, that is heavily hinted at least the likely solution is, later on in the murals of the temple, which we will talk about when it comes up. So yes, as you might imagine, within this temple somewhere is in fact it is a hidden travel room. It was in fact where the boss room was, and it had been corrupted by Orcus. But that is not all, for within this temple is actually a leyline hub, a place long thought to have existed, but seldom few have ever seen one, nor know of one's location. So this place sort of acts as like a crossroads for all the veins of magic that run over Aracséa, and in-game, it's a sort of large circular room with a crystal floating in the center that reaches far down beneath the floor, with like a kind of like the outside of the room is kind of like a balcony, so you can kind of look down and see the crystal reaching further down, and and it kind of it goes down into like an infinite below, and has sort of off of this crystal a projection of sorts. And it's like this golden tree, very much like the tree from Elden Ring, though I had this idea first, but never mind. Usually you would be able to feel like the raw magic of this place being in its presence. That such power is not been picked up by most peoples, but instead, or rather in addition, Stronus in particular could feel the undeath magic seeping from the crystal roots of the shard and the projection of the tree, and obviously like the blackening of this holographic kind of thing as well. So this place was indeed sick. So what was happening here was to show that Orcus corruption, which had been slowly building up in the south, in Rosnia, where the first campaign is, the region of my other campaign, it seemed that through the ley lines his reach was extending far and wide, and had even reached as far into the Frostgales as this was. Lonelywood is right near the north of the Frostgales, of the Ten Towns region at least. So yeah, 2 whole countries that this thing has kind of skipped past. So who knows how far else it would reach if this corruption is left to continue, and the events of Campaign 1 do not conclude soon. That aside, there is also something else of note in this in this room, is that the tree glowing from the crystal is in fact a depiction of the Aid Tree, which was the destination of Freda's pilgrimage. I don't know if you remember her story. It was a place that she never made it to, a great tree that kind of stands at the center of the Vindar Wildlands, as in fact the living tomb of the Archdruid whose the Thrakari are descendant from. This is not common knowledge, but it is kind of rumoured that is the case when you look at them, at least amongst the Thrakari people. It's also an extremely magical place, and is in fact another one of these leyline hubs in the centre of the Vindar Wildlands. So now, hopefully, Freda's story and the cause of her shadow is starting to come into place with you guys, and we've talked in detail about it before, how it links to Orcus, and this is only to help tie a little bit more of those threads. The beast that haunts her is indeed some sort of corruption of Orcus, a facet I believe we have all talked about, like I said. So yes, we'll come a little bit more in detail with that in a second. So the sickness that is kind of heavily hinted at to do with Freda and the affliction that is on the Speaker of Bremen, and maybe even somehow related to Marta's father in Tourmaline, and of course the Sather, her sickness that she's been afflicted with. So let's talk about that for a sec. In another room in this dungeon, there are two things. One is a woman wearing red, completely encased in ice on a flat plane of stone, unbreachable and untouchable. The other, more lore-wise interesting, in this room, murals on the wall, depicting what can only be described as a slave revolt of humans fighting Ainari, wielding what they can only be described as, by the characters, as motes of gas, an arcanochemical weapon in essence. And in fact, all throughout the dungeon there are references to sects of humans aiding the Ainari in this rebellion, and the Ainari giving their praise for defending them, and this we will come back to later, which is worth noting now. But essentially, the mystery of the Ainari disappearance was that they died of a spell plague wrought to them in a revolt from their human slaves. And it is this that the wards on the doors above were attempting to keep within. It was this that wiped the Ainari out all those years ago, and it was this Orcus corrupted magic sickness, one being that escaped and infected the Sather when Ravison convinced them to open this tomb. There are more hints to this in some of the other rooms, one being a main worship area with runes that suggested people came there for healing from the sickness and a transfer of life from one to another. But the important thing is that lore bit. Well, that's one of the first important lore bits to talk about is this notion of the spell plague and being responsible for what wiped out the Ainari. And I don't know if the players 100% piece that together, but that is kind of that is a big mystery in the world. But no one knows what wipes out the Ainari, and the hints for it are there. So that perhaps we can, if that discovery is passed on through Stronus, perhaps maybe that discovery will carry on into Campaign 2 and to Araxian history in the future. Okay, so the woman in Woman in Red in this room as well. We will talk about her another time. This will already be too much of a long video before we get into who she is and how relevant she is to the plot. But know that she is linked to Ravison, and I believe I've talked about it in a previous episode. She has already been mentioned. So, that aside, the next big thing, we'll go on to that. And a question you might already be asking is, how did the spell plague affect the Sather when she is not Ainari or descendant from them? Probably forgot to mention that the spell plague specifically, there's no way the characters will know this, but the spell plague specifically targets elves. Like, you can't control a gas. The humans needed a way to make sure it didn't affect their own people. So it specifically targets the elven bloodline, those descendant from the Fae. So those, I think I've talked about it before, that elves are descended from the Eladrin, essentially, which are a part of the Feywild. All elves are to this day. Ainari, Vrosnian elves, High elves, they're all descendant from that single source. And, so this dungeon will hopefully answer this question about this corruption affecting the Thakari as well. In a side chamber, off to the north of the central hub room, is a solitary sapling sat in soil. Freda, whilst there, hears the spirits call to her to complete her pilgrimage. The sapling is indeed an offshoot of the Age Tree and can be cleansed by those who know how. And Freda begins doing her ritual, the ritual she should have done at the Age Tree proper in Vindel Wildlands. And whilst there, she hears something in a voice that she does not recognise. She in fact hears two voices. One that's womanly and can have multi-layers, says, "Heal me, kindred, cleanse with thy pilgrimage my daughter of Aid, the blood of the Dialadrin." And secondly, a graveling, snarling voice kind of comes in and kind of almost writhes from the bottom of the other voice and completely corrupts it and takes over it and says, "Your world bleeds. It weeps for its end, its deliverance. I am summoned to answer this call. All must fade to live everlasting in undeath, and I shall be its king, Orcus, Prince of Paradise." So, the first voice is the actual voice of the Aid Tree, the voice of the spirit of the Archdruid encased within. The second is, of course, Orcus and his corruption breaking through in that moment of communion. So let's break up what the first voice said and explain a few of those things, things which are still mysteries to the players beyond speculation at the moment. But let's lay it out nice and easily for you. So, daughter of Aid, obviously just denotes her as a descendant of she within the Aid Tree. This you would probably put together yourself. Thrakari descendant from this Archdruid. Pretty self-explanatory, daughter of Aid. But blood of the dire Ladrin, that is something entirely new, something no one in Aracséa would be aware of, bar maybe a few specialists in certain fields, or anyone who's done any sort of research linked to the Inari bloodlines and things like that. And this question we could perhaps answer by looking at what was on the walls that were in this side room with this sapling. So another mural. This is a common trope within Inari ruins. They've been all over the place in both campaigns. This time of an Inari on the left and another browner hued elven race. It seemed to be all in reverence to this tree above it, and a human form formed within and above the tree, almost like a hovering spirit, if you like. Okay, so get ready for this. We need to explain some things even further here before we go a bit more into this. I told you that this was going to be a big lore dump episode, and this is kind of what it is. The other race, this brown-skinned elves that were off to the right, opposite the Inari, I called the Nimue, and they are essentially the ancestors to the Wood Elves. I won't go into the full story. I'll save that for a lore video about the origins of the elves and where they all come from. But just know that the Nimue and Inari share a common ancestor. They are linked somehow. But the basic kind of lowdown. So the Inari, at some point in their rule, performed a ritual that essentially ascended some of the ruling house to some of the ruling house and some of the most powerful mages as well to godhood. For why, again, I will save that for another video, but it is that kind of god ascended bloodline that has been carried on past the Inari's decline. It's this idea of royal blood, or the dragon's blood, the blood of the dire Ladrin that it is called, has continued. And so with this little Nor nugget, it should become apparent now that as a gift for those ancient humans that aided the diaries, they were gifted this blood of dragons, this blood of the dire Ladrin, and thus were born the daughters of Aid, and later the Thrakari, and all of whom hold within them a Nari blood, the blood of Ascension, more or less. That's probably the best name for it, the blood of Ascension. And it is this revelation which reveals why the Thrakari have been affected the way they have by the opening of this tomb and the corruption of Orcus at the Aid Tree. It is also following, it's all following this gifted bloodline, this blood of Ascension, almost feeding off the power of the dire Ladrin. And if they ever hear from Galariel, that priestess who was in the start of the campaign, if she ever gets up here for whatever reason, or if she ever sends a message, they will hear word of things not right in the Vindel wildlands, of people falling ill, specifically around the centre near the tree. The royal houses of the Wood Elves are falling sick because of this. So now, thankfully, that is most of the lore dumping done for this episode, and I can wrap this session diary up saying, in another room there was a puzzle that Thraida successfully completed that revealed to her the tomb of an ancestor, that of Lionel the Wolf, and she received her great axe, a legendary weapon with a bunch of abilities, and the notion that she is one step closer to ridding herself of the curse that haunts her people. It also shows the reverence the Inari had for the ancient Thrakari, as they had entombed her within a holy site of Isha, kind of keeping one of her sacred relics here as well. There's a whole bunch of hoo-ha there, a lot of cool stuff for the players to do. A nice little puzzle. Then there was, of course, the fight with Ravicin herself. Upon entering the travel room, they all hear Ravison talking to someone as she floats. Yes, she floats around the central crystal console of the travel room. Ravison essentially is talking to Aurora, or at least she thinks she is talking to Aurora. All this time, in fact, she is believed to be following Aurora's will, but it has been, in fact, been Orcus this entire time misleading her. And I mean, the gift of a spirit form should be the hint for the players there that this, maybe she's not following Aurora, but we'll get to that. So the idea with Ravison here is that she is trying to do, she's trying to follow Aurora's will as a frost druid, and she's also deeply stricken by this want to help her sister. And her sister is that mysterious figure in red in the other room. Essentially, this is a villain who has done a lot of bad things and been led down an evil path, but for good reasons. And ultimately, she is desperately lost. And I said we will talk about the Lady in Red another episode when we will. I just had to mention that a little bit there. So all throughout the fight, let's just talk about the fight, as she shifts into malformed versions, or rather she shifts into malformed versions of the Thukari Greater Spirits. She taunts Freda and is able to, pose quite a threat to the party as a whole. During the fight, at one point, there's a kind of a growling voice that echoes throughout the room, saying, "My servants never tire." And this is the voice of Orcus through the guise of Aurora. And even as Ravison is slain, Freda wonders if that was actually Ravison they even killed, or if indeed, should she return, Orcus is, after all, the Lord on Death. And that's kind of a brief summary of the fight there. We don't really need to do a play-by-play. And lastly, before we round off the session, there was one more thing that occurred, yeah, I think we could talk about it. This hasn't gone on too long. There was a certain figure that appeared before them, or rather, when they killed Ravison, Mutiny earlier in the session had laid an alarm trap around the Lady in Red figure. Just so that if she were to wake for whatever reason, or if anything were to move past it, she would know. And just as they killed Ravison, the spirit of Ravison, and returned to the leyline room, the alarm bell went off. And their eyes kind of looked over to it, and before them was a human who seemed to be running his fingers along the wall. And this human is in fact Imperious Celasta, someone who has maybe hinted at in a previous episode. This form, I don't think he was hinted by name, but his description was hinted at by Yoshi in a previous session, and they are able to put together that this figure matches the description. Imperious introduces himself, and he introduces himself as somewhat of a Inari specialist, and you guys might recognize Imperious Celasta. He is in fact one of the members of the Azarine Assembly that is up here. Of course, the players don't realize this, not yet at least. So I described to the characters about a somewhat pleasantry kind of meeting that they have. He describes, they kind of get enthused about it. Him, Imperius and Stronus, about the fascination, the nature of this discovery of this ley line and what it could possibly mean for the arcane community as a whole. And they kind of leave, there's a lot of weird insight checks and things like that, but there is a lot of niceties behind this whole interaction. It's very friendly, which I'm surprised the guys didn't pick me up on how weirdly friendly it was. And this is for why. So later on, if the party should ever get a Greater Restoration cast on them, or a Remove Curse, or something like that, something I deem powerful enough to do it, they will in fact remember this moment as it being a fight, and a quite long drawn out fight that was evenly matched, them versus Imperius. And Imperius's last words in that memory is, "You will all do just fine." And then from that moment, so the implication here is that he has modified their memory to forget that fight occurred. You all know what the Inari's goal is up here. They're here to find something that was underneath the glacier. That is their goal. They believe it to be an ancient city which holds magical power that will help their things of world domination. And they obviously are testing the group to hopefully use them to do something. Use them as pawns. And this was one test. Perfidy's interactions with them was another, and this is just the next elevation of that. So yeah, they've been modified memoried, basically. There's a whole group, and they have no idea, I don't believe. I don't think they have any inkling about this at all. But so yeah, after that, they left, and spoke to Yoshi for a bit, had a rest, and they made their way back to Brynshanda. I kind of did I like doing these little cinematic moments sometimes, and as they walked away, I described the camera kind of panning back and them seeing someone with a hood. I kind of seen, if you're looking through the camera, they're looking the back of this person's hood, who just watches them leave, and then this hood, the hood kind of gets blown back in a thing of wind, and they see a white-skinned tiefling kind of watching them, and this is implied to be Perfidy, who has been closely watching the group. This is kind of just a cinematic hint to them that maybe Perfidy and Imperius may be linked somehow. Start dropping some more of these hints of this Azarine storyline as it will begin to become relevant as things move on. So that's it pretty much. Thank you so much with your patience with this one, and especially with the lack of videos I've been putting up recently. I've been super mega busy. I've got a big holiday coming up as well. And yeah, some big news. I'm trying to do some stuff with Spotify. Hopefully you have noticed I have a new mic. I used it for a session a while ago, and they kind of joked, so went, "Oh, we've got Merlin in high definition. This is great." Hopefully you've noticed a difference. I'm very super acutely aware that my audio quality in the past with my stupid shitty headset has not been the greatest. Hopefully this is better. Hopefully this is much better. So yes, there is more to come. I have more things planned, a bunch of things coming up. Thank you so much for you guys for listening and your support and all of this going forward. This has been session 26, An Old Enemy, and we shall see you guys next time.